Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to another install of SeritiTALKS. Today, we'll be talking about project evaluation, looking specifically at measuring the sustainability and effectiveness of the projects that we work on. Today, we're going to do it with a little spin. We're going to do a let's talk. It's not a listen to presentations. You, as the audience, you are encouraged to raise your hand, raise some questions, and engage in the conversation. So, if you guys had listened in on the first M&E webinar, this one is going to be great. And if you missed the first one, the nice thing is you can find it on our YouTube and on our website on Seriti Talks. So, I'm not going to be long, but I'm just going to share a few house rules. So, please note that the talk is being recorded and you'll get a copy of the recording after the talk. You are encouraged and allowed to ask questions, raise your hand, be part of the conversation. If you have anything that you would like us to talk about, please drop it in the chat box or you can put it in the Q&A and we'll get to it. To start off our presentation will be Mbeki from Switch Institute. He will do a brief introduction of himself and then he will lead it over to our other panelists. Thank you so much for joining us and please stay tuned in. Mbeki, over to you.
Thank you, Millicent. My name is Mbeki Ndlovu, and I am the Monitoring, Evaluation, Research and Learning Officer at Seriti. I'm happy to be in this platform once again, and we hope that we can build on where we started from last time when we had a Seriti talk on M&E. And at this point, I think I'm ready to share and to get feedback.
Okay, I'm just going to share the presentation on my screen and then we can get into it. Please do share your questions, burning questions in the Q&A section. Becky, I think this is your time to shine. Will you walk us through the presentation? And yeah.
Thank you. So I think the topic for today is importance of project evaluation. That is project impact evaluations. So I think we can go to the next slide. Now, our presentation outline covers all the topics that are going to be covered by 4 different speakers, and starting with the definition of evaluation, types of evaluation, evaluation criteria, and then we'll spend time on what impact evaluation means in the greening and environment space, and then we'll delve into preparatory work that needs to be done when you're conducting an impact evaluation. We will use some time to talk about challenges, but we'll also use some time to get a perspective from DPME, which is the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation, the South African government. Next page. So our first slide is about defining evaluation. We have 2 definitions that I decided to bring forward. The first definition says evaluation of development projects is the work of assessing the appropriateness of a development project. It's about assessing the appropriateness of a development project through investigating, analyzing, and presenting judgments that are as objective as possible. And then the next one says, it is the systematic and periodic collection of information about activities, characteristics, and outcomes of programs or policies that to make judgments about interventions to improve program effectiveness or inform decisions about future programming. So what is important about these two definitions of evaluation is that you see that judgment is at the center of it, and it requires that we bring facts and we bring information before evaluators so that they can make important judgments and decisions about a program that's been done and completed. Next page. Now, having spoken about evaluation, we'd like to go on to specifically the impact evaluation. Next page. What does it mean? Because we have several types of evaluation. First type is the formative evaluation. And this one usually done during implementation of an intervention. And normally it's done for new programs or an existing program which might need some modification in order to adapt for local context. And then next we have summative evaluations, and that's evaluations that are conducted at the end of a project. That's after a project has been completed. And the focus here is to make sure that you capture the extent to which you have realized outcomes and impacts and your intended objectives. After summative evaluation, we have process evaluation. Process evaluation is normally done during implementation or execution of a project. And the idea is that you want to make sure that your implementation activities are aligned with the plan that you had. If there are any deviations, you would want to record that as well. On outcome evaluation, the focus is on measuring the results and the changes that are brought about a program or an intervention. So you're also assessing the extent to which desired outcomes were achieved or whether the outcomes are sustainable over time. Now that brings us to impact evaluations. What is impact evaluations? I think the key words here is that you're assessing broader and long-term effects and outcomes of a program. So it's something that you also do at the end of a project, and you'd want to see the extent to which you've realized your goals. Next slide.
Before we move on to the next slide, I just want to ask a quick question. From what I'm hearing, what you said about the types of evaluation, would my thinking be correct to say that the evaluation of project A can affect the goals and objectives of the next project?
Yes, indeed, that is correct, because once you conclude an evaluations and you make recommendation, normally such recommendations are supposed to be used to improve the design process of the next phase or the next process. So indeed, it's quite helping.
Okay, thank you.
So here's an attempt to explain something about evaluation criteria. In this case, I'm saying that all of us have been in experience where we do evaluations. So if you were going to evaluate different beverages, what criteria would you use? Now, you can see pictures of different beverages there, and you can see that the packaging is different. And even when you you try to try this, you realize that the taste will be different, the nutritional value will be different. So if you're going to be evaluating these beverages to see which one is good, which one is better, are you going to consider packaging? Are you going to consider the taste, which is about the sweetness or the bitterness? Are you going to consider nutritional value? So what does this say? It says that if you're going to make a determination about which beverage is better, you need to come up with the criteria. That's why even for the evaluators, you need to come up with a criteria. So in the criteria that you develop, you'll have to decide what is good, what is average, and what is what is poor, and you have to assign scores in order for you to have an objective way of dealing with your evaluation process. So the evaluators do the same. Next slide. In the case of evaluation criteria for in the case of evaluation criteria, you would find that I've just identified about 5, but there is more than just 5 criteria that is used in evaluation. And what is evaluation criteria? It's the standards or the measures that are used to assess a program policy. And this criteria helps us to come up with a structure in an objective way of making judgments or decisions about the value or worth of an intervention. So the first part is relevance. So when you're looking at relevance, you're trying to find out whether a particular intervention was a priority or a concern for the local community where it's being implemented. The next criteria will be efficiency. With efficiency, you're looking at to what extent are these inputs leading us to output. So you look at the quantity, everything put together, and you compare with how much output you're getting. And that is what is called efficiency. Effectiveness is about the extent to which program activities have allowed you to reach your desired goals or objectives. So you'll be looking at that particular aspect. Impact as evaluation criteria is about the positives and the negatives. It's about the intended and the unintended effects. And yes, you have to look at those as well. And on the part of sustainability, it's about the extent to which benefits in a program or an intervention are supposed to are supposed to continue even after an intervention has ended. Next. So just to take you through some of the work that we do at Seriti Institute, we do have some programs that where we have objectives that include the issue of eliminating dump sites and reducing pollution. We also have an objective around recycling and safe reuse of materials. And thirdly, we also have, we're also promoting the idea of renewable energy and reducing energy consumption across households. Next slide, please. So this slide tries to summarize the work that's being done in this program that I'm talking about. We start with participants. Number 1 is participants recruited and receiving training. Now in picture number 2, we see that participants are wearing PPE, they have protective clothing, and they are ready to get started and to do some work. They have equipment. And in number 3 and number 4, you can see they actually do the work, the picking up of waste and sorting it into various packaging. And on number 5, you can see that we have a clean space there after the work has been done. Next slide. On this slide, I was trying to show that some of the waste material that is picked, it gets to be used. It gets to be recycled, taken, and then used for something else, which is something that's very much positive. So you can see that these cold drink bottles have been put together and they are being used to build an eco bench. That's what we call it. They were doing it in the Eastern Cape. In number 2, you can see that it's construction. Number 3, it's complete. And then number 4, the structure has been painted, but also there's been beautification happening around it. You try to put some flowers and make it look better. And we do all this in order to make sure that once you've cleaned a dump site, you want to make sure that dumping doesn't continue. You convert the use into something else so that the community can have a much cleaner environment. Next slide.
Before we move on, I just want to ask, what is the significance of having all these steps that you are displaying on the current slide, where you're showing us the process of them getting to the eco brick? What is the significance of keeping such evidence?
Yes, indeed. I think operating in the environment that we operate as NPOs and as development organizations, we have to, from time to time, try to make sure that we demonstrate to funders, we demonstrate to communities that we serve that there is work that's being done. Sometimes if you don't document that yourself, it becomes difficult for you to show that indeed there is work that was done.
Okay. So it's more to also benefit the community to just see and your funders to see the work that is actually being done. Instead of just seeing reports with numbers going up and down in graphs, they see something that is real, that humanizes the project. Okay.
Indeed, it's more important even for the community members, because we want them to see that this is something that this is an initiative that they can actually do as community members and generate an income while they're doing it. They're making the environment cleaner, but they're also generating an income for themselves. So what you see on the left-hand side column here is a summary of the activities that we're describing in pictures in the previous slides. And I think when you are going to be doing an impact study or impact evaluation, the question is, are you going to be focusing on the inputs, the activities, outputs, outcomes, and impacts? Now, on the outputs, we can see that it says that training workshops have been completed, roadshows have been completed, and the door-to-doors, you've done them. You have cleaned dump sites, but still the question is, so what? That's the question that's very common when we're doing evaluation. So once you've done those, then what does it mean? So it's supposed to lead us to outcomes. And in the outcomes, we see that it says beautification of clean spaces, reduced number of illegal dump site, recycling initiatives that started, and clean environment and public spaces. So when you are doing an impact study, if you can click just once, you will notice that the focus has to be on the areas that are shown by the red lines. It's the outcomes and the impacts. So when you decide that it's an impact evaluation that you're doing, it has to focus on that and to make sure that much as completing training is good, but if you say you're doing an impact evaluation, it means you have to look at outcomes more and look at how far you're doing in terms of contributing towards the impact that you stated in your goals, in your project goals. Next. This is my last slide on this, and as I was preparing for this presentation, I thought I came across this one and I said I'll share it with you. So on the first frame, you can see that there are three people there, they're talking. And the gentleman in the middle says, I taught Stripe how to whistle. And the reply goes, I don't get to hear him whistling. And the initial speaker says, I said I taught him. I didn't say that he learned it. So this takes us back to what I was saying earlier on. It's so important that we can't be doing so many activities around us. We know that we've completed this training, we've done campaigns, but to what extent is that taking us to the outcomes and the impacts that we need? I think this is a question for all of us to say, to what extent, and how do we like to see ourselves in the sort of role that we're playing in terms of doing this evaluation work. I think I'll pause for that and to check if there's any questions or feedback.
We have one question. Okay. Oh no, the question was not about the presentation. So maybe we can open the floor for a little bit of conversation before we move on to the next presentation, or do we go to the presentation and then come back if there are no burning questions, or just something that you want to share with the rest of us? if we don't have burning questions, then we can proceed with the presentation. Is that okay with everyone? Oh, here's a question. It says, how can project managers establish mechanisms for continuous monitoring of both effectiveness and sustainability after a project is completed?
Okay. I don't know whether this question is appearing. It's actually covering my face. Okay. My quick thinking on that particular question will be to say, as organizations, we have to be proactive we have to be intentional about what we want to achieve. We need to, in our planning, we need to already incorporate M&E. We need to think about the sort of outcomes and impacts that we would want to make. So we need to spend some time doing something that we call theory of change. And the theory of change basically shows us the different pathways that are supposed to apply when we're implementing a particular intervention. So we have to make an effort, because out of the theory of change, you're able to see the sort of different things that you're supposed to be doing, but also to develop your own project logical framework, and so that everybody knows what goals you have, and you have a common approach to it.
Okay, are you satisfied with the answer, or would you like to have a follow-up question? We do have, let's see. Is there a standard template or direct specific questions for conducting an impact evaluation?
I would say there are certain things that you're going to we expect. If you're going to be conducting an evaluation, we expect that you have to have thought about what was the goal of the project. You need to review documentation that sort of was supposed to guide your project in terms of what you're supposed to achieve. And based on that, you are able to then to decide on what sort of approach you're going to apply, what sort of criteria, we're speaking about criteria, you're going to use, and what type of evaluation. It's not always going to be impact evaluation that's going to be applicable. Sometimes it might be another type of evaluation. And then you can begin to plan and put in place everything that you need to conduct such an evaluation.
Okay. Thank you so much for that. And I think we are learning. I know for sure that I'm learning a lot, and I hope that everyone else is learning. So at this point in time, we'll move on with the presentation, and our next speakers can come in and share with us. I'm just going to share my screen with you guys just now. I'm hoping that the good doctor can do a brief introduction of himself, the work that he does before he gets into the whole preparatory work for an impact evaluation, so we can get acquainted and get comfortable with him. Dr. Mbuso.
I don't see him on the platform. Let me try to get in touch. Let me check.
Okay, in the interest of time, we'll just move it along and we'll come back to this part of the presentation. The nice thing is that each of these topics are alone standing and they can make sense. So we're going to move over to Khanyile and Anne, and they will do a brief introduction of themselves, and they will go through their presentation. Khanyisa and Anne, welcome.
Thank you very much, Millicent. I'm glad
You're
you've spelled
welcome.
my name. Yeah, I'm glad you've spelled my name correctly now because you had
Yeah,
started.
your name gave me a challenge.
Yeah, you had started with Khanyile, but it's fine. I just want to say thank you for the opportunity, and also just to extend my greetings to the rest of the audiences, and also just to thank Seriti Institute for the recognition as the department. I think is my video on?
I can't see you.
Okay, I think I have made a mistake. I'm not sure if colleagues can see me now, but my background
Now
is
we can see you.
my background is a bit dark. But okay, it's fine. I was saying that we'll just want to extend our gratitude to the organization for the invitation. We feel very honored to be part of this platform. And then also just to say that it is such a good thing that we are being recognized as a department, especially that we are the custodians of evaluations in the country. I will briefly give a talk on just a few slides of my presentation, and my colleague Anne, who's in the platform here, is going to cover the rest of the presentation. Basically, what I'm going to give here is just an overview on evaluations, and she will take on more issues in terms of the impact evaluation. So as DPME, the evaluation unit we are from the evaluation unit within DPME, and we have continuously promoted evaluations as an effective tool to making for decision making tool. This tool works across all levels and sectors of government in different contexts, and it also applies to all citizens. I'm sure you're projecting on your screen. You can move it to the next slide. Yeah, so just to give you a small background on our work is that in overall, we are guided by the National Evaluation Policy Framework. All evaluations in the department are guided by that. The National Evaluation Policy Framework is it just provides a minimum standard for evaluations across all government. And it also ensures that we promote quality evaluations, which can be used for learning to improve the effectiveness and impact of government interventions. So this policy was adopted by government and approved by cabinet. And the first development was done in 2011 and adopted by the cabinet. And we are now working on the revised policy document, which is our 2019 NEPF. And then this current policy document extends the scope of evaluations to the state-owned entities and local government. So in essence, it's just extending or institutionalization evaluations in SCOs and local government. So that's the background of the National Evaluation Policy Framework. And coming to the applicability of the National Evaluation Policy Framework, as I've mentioned, that the scope has been extended to local government and also state-owned entities, is that in overall, this policy applies to national, provincial, local spheres of government. It also applies to all institutions as provided for the Chapter 19 of the Constitution. It goes on to government components and also all public entities listed in Part A of the PMFA. Thank you. Just to reinforce, I know my colleague Mbeki, he might have touched on some of the things here, but just to reinforce on what you might have touched on, what exactly do we mean by evaluations? And it's also good that once we talk about the term evaluations, we also distinguish it between monitoring. What exactly is monitoring? Because often what we normally find out is that there's also a confusion as to what monitoring is and as to what evaluation is. And also that you might find that these two terms are being applied in different organizations. Sometimes it's only the M being applied and less of the E being applied. So as DPME is that evaluations as reflected on our National Evaluation Policy Framework, and what the National Evaluation System applies to is that it has an element of a value judgment. So first thing foremost is that it has that element of a value judgment beside different from monitoring, which it's more about tracking the progress of evaluations. So there are quite a number of reasons why we evaluate, and as illustrated by this diagram is that we evaluate to make sure that we improve performance in our interventions, and also when we do a continuous evaluation, sorry, when we do our evaluations, we also want to provide feedback to the program managers as the implementers of different interventions. By interventions, I'm referring to policies, projects, or other programs. And then another reason why we're doing this is also just to improve accountability. It's also good to be accountable of where the public spending is going, and also just to measure and see if the spending is also making a difference in the community or in the target group of interest. And another key reason is that we also want to improve decision-making in terms of should changes be made to the intervention while the program is still running or the project is still running, or should we increase budget with regard to that specific intervention? And then the first one that I should have started with is also increase knowledge about WEGs and what is working and what is not working. So it's also very crucial that we also evaluate to make sure that we are able to track and see what exactly or how the program is doing. And also to quickly look at this one, I just want to emphasize that we have different types of evaluations. There are many types of evaluations, but as our national evaluation system, we have looked at 6 types of evaluations. You'll pardon me, the synthesis evaluation is not reflected on the slide, but these evaluations are the ones that the NES, the National Evaluation System, has made provision of. We can talk about the diagnostic evaluation, which mainly look at the root causes, underlying issues of a specific intervention. So when we do diagnostic evaluations, we're just checking what are the root causes of a specific program. And it also, these evaluations, if you can see from, as you can see from the slide there, it is linked to the intervention module or result chain. Talk about your input, your activities, your outcomes, and your outputs and outcomes up to impact. So all these different types of evaluations are linked into the result chain. So also another interesting evaluation, I don't want to dwell much on those ones because I know the basics of today's presentation is more about the impact evaluation, and my colleague Anne is going to touch on that. Just to give you the differences between these ones. Also, the design evaluation, which mainly looks at the theory of change, is another type of evaluation that our National Evaluation Policy Framework continue to emphasize. So this one can be conducted to assess whether the theory of change or underlying causes effect or relationships are strong enough so that they can result to an envisaged change. So it mainly looks at the different element of the theory of change and see if these results are holding. Just to give you an example, is that DPME has also done a design evaluation of the draft policy on community colleges. This was done with the Department of Higher Education and Training. It's another type of design evaluation that was done. So it's also to show you that it's not about that particular intervention being implemented, but also just to assess if the change that is being envisaged is able to work. And then there's also an implementation evaluation, which really assess what is happening and why it's happening. It also helps program managers and implementers to see where exactly they can make changes or improve the project or intervention while it's still running. We also have an interesting one. We normally don't do an economic evaluation as a standalone. It's normally tied with or merged with other types of evaluation, like the implementation evaluation. So whilst you're doing your implementation evaluation or impact evaluation, there's also an opportunity where you can also do your economic or evaluation, economic evaluations assessments, just to see what are the cost benefit of that particular intervention. With regards to implementation evaluation, we also have other evaluations that are running. For example, there's a policy, an implementation evaluation on white paper for persons with disabilities. That's another type of implementation evaluation as well. So there's various types of evaluations that are happening that we normally undertake just to assess how the program or how the project is running. Thank you very much, Chair. I would like to hand over to my colleague, Ahn-Lynn. And over to you.
Thank you very much, Chair. And thank you, colleagues, for the opportunity to be here this morning. I will be taking over the presentation, just speaking specifically to impact evaluation, which you can see is one of the many types of evaluations that the DPME does promote within government, ultimately, the SA government, that is. So in terms of the purpose of impact evaluation, I think Khanyisa has briefly touched on some of these aspects. The first is to inform policy decisions. Ultimately, our political leaders want to know what is happening, why, where, how a certain intervention is impacting the overall goals and vision of our country. And of course, a lot of the interventions within government to feed into our National Development Plan of 2030, our ultimate vision. So they do want to see some level of impact on what's really going on ultimately. So it really does feed into policy decisions. The second purpose for impact evaluation specifically is that it improves intervention design and implementation ultimately. And I will be touching on this. This leads to obviously things like how the theory of change looks and just measuring the ultimate implementation, what has happened, what has taken place, etc. Third aspect is that there is a level of accountability that comes through with conducting an impact evaluation. You do see that in what has taken place, and it's ultimately a bigger conversation that does happen. And lastly, informing service delivery ultimately is important, and the results of the impact evaluation study does impact not just how the intervention has played out, but also what that means for the end users at the end of the day. Next slide, please. So with regard to the methodological elements to consider when conducting impact evaluations, we have different methods that are needed and different elements within impact evaluations that need to be considered. There are 5 overarching elements that need to be considered when conducting an impact evaluation specifically. The first being that you need to clarify what your objectives and values are. And in a minute, I'll break down each one of these 5 so that the colleagues can really see how it plays a role in how you need to think about conducting an impact evaluation. The second is you need to develop theory of change. In most instances, what we come to find is that interventions do not have program documents, never mind a theory of change on board. So it becomes very difficult to be able to even evaluate that intervention that we find on our table ultimately. The third element is
and let me just quickly dive in just a little bit. How do people get to a stage of developing a theory of change? Is this something you do prior to having a program, or something you do as the program is running?
I'm glad you asked that question. So a theory of change in an ideal world should be done when you're planning the intervention. But what we come to find in government is that the political leaders will say, I want 10 houses built in this area, and people go straight into the doing part. They don't sit down and really think about how that project or intervention will play out. So there's very little planning that comes in play. And as I've mentioned, in some instances, what we find is when somebody comes to us to say, let's do an evaluation on this program, we don't have any program document in place at all. And that's just very discerning. It's really, really uncomfortable because there was no sense of thinking how this thing is going to play out. And when you're planning for an intervention in the planning stage, that is where the theory of change needs to be utilized as a tool for planning. In a theory of change, it highlights activities, inputs, outputs, outcomes, and impact of that intervention and the various resources that need to be pushed into that intervention design itself, in an attempt to understand the logic flow of that intervention. So what happens is there is no theory of change that happens. So when we eventually do an evaluation, what we do is we ask them not just for the program document, but also for the program people to sit down and for us to develop a theory of change from scratch on an intervention that has already been implemented. And for the program people to work backwards in terms of what they initially envisioned that intervention to be, it becomes a bit of a struggle. Yes, they can indicate what inputs were done, like the human resources, etc., where the money came from and all of those other aspects. But really for them to think about what it is that we were trying to implement, what was the initial impact that we were thinking about having with this intervention, what were the initial outputs, it's very difficult to reverse back to actually developing that theory of change. But we do force them to do that because we use the theory of change in the evaluation process itself. So I hope I answered your question on that one.
Thank you. We can move on.
Yes, we can move. Yes, great.
Yes.
The third element is answering descriptive questions that need to be considered in impact evaluation. And again, I will just break that down in the next couple of slides on how that looks. The fourth aspect is causal questions. In any impact evaluation design, causality is what is key. You want to be able to see, based on a baseline, what was initially envisioned versus what has taken place, and just to be able to measure a sense of causality, what has taken place. And lastly, summarizing evidence into overall judgment. You need to understand how you're taking the evidence forward and what the so what aspect comes into play. Can I move on to the next slide? So when you look at the first elements around, clarifying objectives and values, you really need to consider impact evaluation questions around what are the desired impacts, what are the negative impacts that had occurred in the intervention. And particularly when you ask these type of questions, you need to consider some methodological approaches in your analysis of really digging deep into what it is that was initially wanted. So you look into things like desktop review, literature review, just to get a sense of what has taken place. Are there other countries that have done similar things in an intervention? So you really look at those approaches to get a sense of what was initially desired for the impact that you wanted in an intervention. The second element that you need to think about is, again, the development of the theory of change. And I have spoken about that just momentarily. You need to really use the theory of change in terms of understanding what is working in practice, and develop a theory of change. And of course, the theory of change and the logical framework, those are the two tools that we do use in any evaluation, not just impact, to really understand what is going on in this intervention, and really sitting down with program managers and having that discussion ultimately with what it is that they wanted in the intervention itself. So those are some of the approaches that would come in this specific element. Next slide, please. So the next aspect is considering the descriptive questions. What has been implemented, what activities had taken place, what is the quality of the implementation of that intervention, what mechanisms, agencies, who was involved in implementing that specific intervention that you're looking into. And this is where more of the so-called qualitative research methodologies come into play. You would be utilizing, observation studies, interviews, focus group discussions, key informant interviews, and also looking into the monitoring data that's really available for the intervention. What happens is, this is where the M and the E come into play, where people don't understand. Where the M is very important is we want that monitoring data, but it's also a catch-22 situation where you find the monitoring data that's already on the table, that's collected, is not always sufficient enough for the evaluation that you want to be doing on that intervention. It might be a bit thin on the ground. And again, it links back to the original part where I said, when you're planning the intervention, you need to understand what is it that what data you want to collect on a monitoring basis, what is the theory of change, what it is in terms of the outputs that you are really generally monitoring ultimately. And that comes into the fore ultimately. It becomes such a big issue when people say, oh, we want to do an impact evaluation. And, the monitoring data is thin on the ground. So DPME, generally what we try to also advise some of the departments is try and do an implementation evaluation, which is closer to the process evaluation. Rather do that first as a basis for undertaking an impact evaluation. That's just some of the advice that we give our departments, noting that the political leaders want to see impact, but at least through an implementation evaluation type, you can at least see some of the emerging impact, and it gives you a bit of a baseline to work with on the information that you need in prep for an impact evaluation to be undertaken. Next slide, please. The fourth aspect is the causal questions that you need to consider answering when undertaking an impact evaluation. Of course, you have the qualitative and quantitative approach, the mixed method approach in any evaluation, but more specifically in the impact evaluation, the quantitative aspect comes out really strongly in the causal questions that you need to be considering in answering when you undertake an impact evaluation. For instance, how far has the intervention ultimately been impacted? What's the causality aspect? How much of the impact can be attributed to the intervention itself? And these type of approaches, research approaches, are very statistically driven when you look at the counterfactual methodology that needs to be considered. For instance, regression analysis, randomized controlled trials. This is again, you'd need a statistician to come into play here to really assist you with not just the sampling, but also these statistically driven approaches that you need to incorporate to really get a sense of the causality that needs to come out here. Because remember, you want a form of baseline to measure something against. And again, that's also where the theory of change comes into play, just to assist you also to see what is it that we wanted originally versus what has taken place, and then measure that ultimately. So it's just that element that has to come into play there. Next slide, please. So ultimately, number 5 is looking at, summarizing the evidence into overall judgment. In any essence, in any report that we produce, the findings and recommendations of the report are so essential, specifically the recommendations, because that's what we use to ultimately make a difference. The usage element comes into play with the recommendations. And of course, you want to have that overall narrative. The so what needs to come out really strongly of any evaluation report. And DPME does have a guideline on just assisting people on how to really create strong recommendations out of reports, and just thematically categorize what that looks like, really to capture what it is that we need to do with the findings of this report so that we can utilize it in an action plan, what we call an improvement plan, really to outline what it is that we can do to ultimately use the recommendations more effectively. So your cost-benefit analysis does come into play here, more specifically on the impact evaluations, because at the end of the day, you also want to know the money aspect, how much we've spent on this intervention. And I want to say as a sideline, our National Treasury, they do utilize evaluation reports as a base for departments to motivate for more money for that intervention that they have ongoing, because as you know, we all need more money, and evaluation reports, specifically impact evaluation reports, really do form an evidence base for them to really say, yes, you do need more money. This is where we can assist you, and it is from that evidence base that does occur ultimately. Next slide, please. So in terms of the crucial issues when planning and managing impact evaluation, as you can see, there are about 4 elements that you need to think about. The first is relevance and timeliness. You need to see where is it that you need to undertake an impact evaluation. We try to propose to departments, when you're planning the intervention from the get-go, again, in an ideal world, you would then say, okay, after 5 to 10 years, we want to undertake an impact evaluation. But it also depends on if there is some type of policy or political, goal that needs to happen, or something happens that you need this impact evaluation for. So that does come into play, the timeliness aspect. Is there a decision that needs to be taken politically on that intervention? Does that policy need to change? What needs to occur? I think the timeliness aspect needs to be coming in quite firmly when planning for an impact evaluation and managing it ultimately. The next is, of course, legitimacy aspect. You need to have stakeholders being involved in every single process of the evaluation itself. You need to have the buy-in of the stakeholders. You can't do things in isolation from stakeholders. And of course, you need to have a steering committee, which needs to act as an oversight body, just to legitimize the process, and ultimately the final report of the impact evaluation on the table, that needs to come in quite clearly. So the process itself needs to be legitimized, and you need to have a level of quality assurance right across the process when you're conducting an impact evaluation. The next aspect is the credibility of evidence. And that is, of course, linked to not just, like I said, the monitoring data that is used, but also in terms of, how you sample your research. The sampling comes into play. I know a lot of evaluation reports that we do, especially within the DPME, it's nationwide, and people always say, no, we need to sample the entire country, which means that, you need to collect data in every single one of the 9 provinces. It becomes really expensive, and you need to also consider, where you sample, rural, urban, all those factors come into play. So the credibility of the evidence is so important. Why are you sampling certain provinces versus others? And also really highlighting the limitations of your research needs to come in very clearly, and that also links to the usage aspect as well, so that people are aware of the limitations of your study ultimately. And of course, lastly, the trade-offs that you need to consider. Are you conducting that impact evaluation internally with your own staff, or are you outsourcing this impact evaluation? Is it externally done? And of course, that will be impacted on the costs as well, what your budget is. So there will always be trade-offs in any study that's done within government. So we do really alert the colleagues. I mean, the average evaluation we do, it's around 2.5 million. So again, it's linked to the sampling frames, and traditionally impact evaluations are more costly than the other types of evaluations that we do have and promote as DPME in the SA government system. Next slide, please. So I just added the 2 reference documents that The first is our so-called Bible, our National Evaluation Policy Framework of 2019. That's our Bible. And then from there, we've created various guidelines and templates really to assist government to make it easier, user-friendly in how to undertake the different types of evaluations. We also have different guidelines on approaches of evaluations. For instance, rapid evaluation approaches. Like I say, that's just one of many, just to assist departments in how they can go about undertaking evaluations. So I just put one of the guidelines, which I'm speaking about today, which is the Impact Evaluation Guideline, which we developed back in 2014. We are busy reviewing this guideline. However, it still remains very relevant to the current context that we're in. And these documents can be found on our DPME website. So the colleagues are more than welcome to have a look at that. Thank you to the chair. I'll hand over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. You mentioned quite a few things. You talked about, the cost of evaluation. You spoke on sampling, and I think for me, I want to get to a point where we talk impact. Does one project create impact, or does it contribute to an overall impact? If you're running one project in Soshanguve, do we say you've made a contribution maybe to the waste management, or the project on its own has made impact? I'm not sure if you're getting my question.
No, I hear you. I think it comes where, again, it goes back to the theory of change. In a program, you have many mini projects that feed into that program. So on a project level, that might be an output in the bigger scheme of a program. And so I think it's just a matter of knowing what is it, what unit of analysis are you evaluating? Are you evaluating a project? Are you evaluating a program? Because like you had mentioned, that example of a waste management situation, that would, in my world, feed into a bigger program on waste management within that specific department. So it's just, we are very specific with departments as well to say, please indicate what unit of analysis, what is it that we are evaluating? And that helps us. As Khanya had mentioned, we've done an evaluation on a draft policy, a design evaluation on a draft policy that wasn't even approved by cabinet, wasn't even implemented. It was literally a draft policy. And in order to finalize that policy, they were like, well, we want to do an evaluation on this draft policy before we finalize it, to see realistically, before we even implement it, can this be done? Is it realistic? So it's just a matter of being very clear about what is it that you're evaluating, what unit of analysis are you evaluating, and then indicating what type of evaluation you want to undertake, whether it be an implementation evaluation, a process evaluation, whatever it is, and then the approach. Do you want it to be a rapid evaluation? Do you want it to be a sector evaluation? What approach do you want to undertake? And of course, we as DPME, we know there are limited resources around any type of evaluation. And so we do ask departments to really leverage on the resources that they do have. For instance, again, in the sampling methodology, we for instance, work very closely with the Northern Cape. We've told them, we know that you guys don't have the capacity to collect the primary data, the interviews, etc. It's costly to go into the rural areas. It's time, all those things. So how do we be a bit innovative in collecting the raw data? And then we proposed to them, why don't you have an MOU with your local university, University of the Saul Plaatjes, for instance, have an MOU with them and utilize the students that can get a little bit of work experience, research experience, and utilize them to gather your data for you. And that way it's a win-win, just example. So just some of those elements, especially if you're going to be doing it internally and you have those cost barriers, what can you do? Who can you leverage? Which partners can you bring on board to get what you want ultimately? I think that's what it's about. And of course, you're sampling what it is that you want. That's clear. Yeah, I hope I answered your question there.
No, you actually did, because I always get confused to say, is the impact per project or is it a contribution? But now I think I have a clearer understanding of what you mentioned. Dr. Mbuso is now going to close for us with his part of the presentation. If you guys have any burning questions, please leave them in the Q&A box, and then we'll be able to answer them as we go, as we wrap up. Doctor, welcome to the talk, and now is your time to talk about the preparation that goes behind these big projects and the impact that we are all driving.
Thank you very much, colleagues, and apology for the fact that technology failed us at the most critical time. Because of time constraints, I think I would make my presentation by way of summarizing what the three previous speakers have talked about. So I'm Mbuso Moyo, a postdoctoral fellow from the University of Johannesburg. I think the starting point really is to try to amplify what the previous speakers have said. I think the first thing they said is that evaluation forms an integral element of the whole spectrum of project implementation, and that it happens at different stages of project implementation from the beginning. Hence, we speak about, baseline evaluation. In the mid of the project implementation, hence we talk about developmental or process evaluation. Towards the end of project implementation, hence we talk about, outcome or end of term evaluation. And indeed, at the end or after project implementation, hence the focus of my discussion here is impact evaluation. And as the previous speakers have said, impact evaluation is about looking at an intervention and the changes, long-term changes it makes on the target population or the beneficiaries. And oftentimes, because of the expectations that are placed by those who fund projects, whether it's governments, whether it's government agencies, or whether it's donor funders, that the people who implement projects must show the changes that these projects are making. People tend to believe that impact evaluation is all about showing the positive changes. In fact, it is about showing both the positive and the negative changes, the unintended and the intended changes, the direct and indirect changes. And that's very important, because ultimately when you do an evaluation, you want to learn lessons from what your project has been doing. There are two types of impact evaluations which I have not included on the slide here. The first is what is called ex-ante impact evaluation. And the second is the ex-post impact evaluation. Oftentimes, project implementers do the ex-post project impact evaluation, which is about looking at the impact of a project at least 1 year after the implementation end of the project. Ex-ante impact evaluation is about evaluating a project as you continue to implement it. I think Ahn-Lynn actually spoke to a very important point about the primary concern of impact evaluation being establishing a cause for causality. And when I say approaches to establishing a cause for causality, I'm speaking to exactly what she spoke about. How do you establish a cause for causality? Said you could actually use two primary ones. The first is to use a baseline, which is studying the status quo, establishing the status quo, and using that status quo as a benchmark against which comparisons would be made. And I use a baseline, I also refer to a baseline as a reflexive methodology. For instance, you want the attitudes of people to gender-based violence. So you do awareness campaigns in a particular community. First, you do a baseline about the attitudes of people to gender-based violence. At a particular point before the start of the project, after some time, you then go back to that community, the very same community, to measure their attitudes to gender-based violence after used anything else but one group of people that you are targeted, thus comparing a group to itself over time. That's what I mean by reflexive methodology. The second aspect, you could use an experimental or quasi-experimental approach where you make use of two groups. First, the treatment group, which is the group on which you are going to target your intervention, versus the control group that is not going to receive the intervention, but you are going to look at the changes on these groups over time. If there is going to be a change on the treatment group after your intervention, then you could, with some degree of absolute certainty, say that that very intervention is observed. I should.
Okay. We have a question from Richard. He's asking, what are the stages of conducting impact evaluation on a newly established non-profit company?
If I understand you well, you're talking about a company as an intervention, as a project. So I
Yes.
think my previous colleagues have already spoken to baseline. What is the status quo before that new intervention? As I said, you use that status quo as a benchmark against which you are going to measure progress. And the other stages, my colleagues have really explained them, but maybe we're going to cover them as we proceed with my presentation. Next slide, please. I want to pose this example as a way of generating a discussion, and so I would like any takers to come in. The example goes, we want to measure the impact of a water supply project on the time household members spend on fetching water. The average time falls after the implementation of the project. By average time, I'm talking about the average time that household members take to fetch water. What would you think would be the plausible explanation, would be the principal explanation for the fall in the average times taken by household members in fetching water? That's my first question. The second question is there a need for a comparison or control group from outside the project area? What is the difference between the counterfactual and the baseline? Any takers?
These questions are open to the floor, so if you do want to interact, please do raise your hand and then you can have your opportunity to share your side.
Anyways, I think the plausible explanation is the question of proximity. It could be that that project, in fact, established water points near to where household members are located. And thus that could explain why they are taking less time to fetch water. Is there a need for a comparison group? I don't think so, because this intervention only primarily limited to a specific community within a given time span. So there is no need to compare it to any other group outside of the project area. What I want us to think about very carefully, because it does tend to confuse people, the counterfactual and the baseline, which Ahn-Lynn spoke to. Is there a difference between not having a baseline and not having a counterfactual? The counterfactual is the condition that would have obtained even in the absence of the intervention. So when I say we do not have a counterfactual, could that obtain? Is that a reality? Could there be a situation where one implementing a project does not have a counterfactual? Could there be a situation one implementing a project does not have a baseline? You could indeed not conduct a baseline when implementing a project. That is to say, go into strategically and intentionally understanding the status quo at the beginning of the project. But that does not entail that you are not going to have a counterfactual. A counterfactual is a situation that would always obtain even if there was no project implemented. So as I said, we can proceed to our next slide. I said my presentation is going to be by way of responding to what the previous colleagues have said. I think the previous three speakers also spoke to the importance of a theory of change. I think a theory of change is very important because it nudges us to think about, firstly, what we want to achieve. To imagine about what we want to achieve actually directs us to think about our goal. In the example I have given here, this person wants to be full-bodied, that is, they want to gain weight, and they want to gain weight of 6 kilograms over a 6-month period. Their objective is to consume sweet foods, high in calories. And their example of a sweet food here is a cake. Having that objective, that goal and objective in mind, they then begin to think about what are the sequential steps they are supposed to undertake in order to realize that goal over a 6-month period. That is when we go down to, I can't see at the bottom, to the idea of inputs. So you need time, you need ingredients, you need flour, and you then make assumptions that my weight gain is not going to be affected by any reason or medical reason. And that the inputs that you need for baking a cake are going to be found in shops. You then go to the activities. What do you need to do in order to realize that, or to have a cake? Because ultimately you want a cake in order to have a sweet food. You want to eat a cake in order to gain weight. You need to mix ingredients and bake a cake. And what were the indicators thereafter? And that is the most important thing which the colleagues from DPME spoke to. The idea is that you've got to be able to measure the change that we imagine. And the way to measuring the change that we imagine is by way of using indicators. And there are different types of them: qualitative indicators, quantitative indicators, descriptive indicators, and what have you. So I've been asked to wrap up here. And so I'm not going to, if you can scroll down to some of my slides, which I had. So when you are planning to do an impact evaluation, The most important thing, and the colleagues have spoken to that, is the starting point. When I speak to the starting point, I'm talking about you've got to decide about whether it is the right time to do an evaluation and what kind of evaluation that would be. But in terms of impact evaluation, it must not be too long after the intervention has been made or implemented, or before the intervention is implemented. Internal or external, you need to weigh the disadvantages and advantages of an evaluation, impact evaluation done by a team internal to or responsible for project implementation. Then, of course, establish a steering committee, establish the objectives, and then, of course, the key evaluation questions. What do you want to ask in terms of the evaluation? You can go to the next slide, please.
This would be our last slide before we take in there are some burning questions in the Q&A, and then we can close off. So this would be the last slide.
Yes, that slide is self-explanatory. It speaks to how do you formulate, key evaluation questions and etc. And I think I will end it there. The rest of the things were really covered by my colleagues. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So there are questions here. Someone asked, how do you integrate evaluation results into project management processes to drive continuous improvement? This question goes to anyone in the audience or our speakers. Let's just quickly answer it in a minute or two and then move on to the last question, which is essentially not a question, but we'll move into it. So anyone, how do we integrate this M&E and projects as we go?
Sorry, can you repeat the question again?
The question says, how do you integrate evaluation results into project management processes to drive continuous improvement?
Oh, maybe, okay, Anne, do you want to take it, Anne? I see Anne's hand is up.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. So I can speak from a government perspective. I did mention in my presentation that we do have what we call an improvement plan process, where we actually utilize recommendations from any evaluation report into an action report, breaking down exactly how those recommendations will be actioned. And when we take it a step further with departments that we work with to incorporate those activities into the annual performance plans of the departments that they work in, and then it eventually gets filtered down into their performance agreements to action some of those aspects on a very program level scale. And then from there, depending on the provincial departments that they work with, if it does impact the provincial departments that they work with, they then filter it into their performance agreements and annual performance plans ultimately. So that is realistically how it works on a government scale. And that is how we were able to track that the utilization of the evaluation report is actually done. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. So someone is asking, are there platforms or libraries where they can get access to this resources, where they can get templates that show them how do you do a theory of change, how do you evaluate a project, how do you conduct a sampling? Do we have a place where we can direct people where they can get this templates and start customizing and using them for their own projects?
Let me, if I could take that one, I must say, if you go to the internet, you could search and find quite a number of different templates. But I think the important thing is to also make sure that you understand your own theory of change, because you have to look for the right thing to use and something that will actually be helpful. There is lots of information that you can get, but you have to first understand what it is that you're looking for and how it sort of comes together to help you in terms of managing your projects and making sure that you conduct proper evaluations. Yeah.
Okay, I think we can have Anne, and then we can have the doctor close off, and then To answer this question, if there is a direct library where they can actually just maybe type in on the internet to find where they can get all those different templates on.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, the DPME, we do have quite a number of guidelines and templates on different types of evaluations, different approaches that you can undertake, different templates on actually the final product of a evaluation report. So we even have templates for how to set up a steering committee, terms of reference for steering committees. So all these templates and guidelines we do have on our DPME website. If you will allow me, Chair, I can always just share the link in the chat box for the
Please do
colleagues.
share in the chat box so they can just quickly get access to it.
Great.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining on this very informative conversation. I myself have learned a lot. I didn't know that there was monitoring, evaluation, research, and learning. I just thought it's one thing, it's your boss looking at what you're doing and saying you're not putting in enough. I thought when you do impact reports, it's when you just put out the good of this is how much we did. And you did. I thought we didn't put the section where we talk about the shortcomings and realizing that when you do add those ones, it helps you prepare for the next project. I think that is a very good learning. Once again, thank you so much to everyone who had joined and participated in this talk. And who knows, we might have a third M&E talk because I can't get enough of this information. I want to learn more. Considering the work that we do with the communities, it's important that we always keep ourselves educated. Thank you so much, guys. Do not forget, this recording will be available on our website and on our YouTube. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Cheers.
Thank you. Have a good day.